Well, hi there and welcome to Putting Users in the Driver's Seat, 9 interactive features of the Ignite UI grid. Today I'll show you how the features of this jQuery UI-based grid can make a big difference in the way users interact with the data in your applications. First, I'll take you through a quick tour of the architecture of the control and then dive into some of the demos on sorting and filtering, selection, paging, column grouping, column sizing, column moving, tooltips, and virtualization. So I hope you enjoy our time here together, and make sure to like Infragistics on Facebook and follow us on Twitter so you can keep track of all the goings on around Infragistics and Ignite UI. All right, well, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's dive right in here. Now, knowing the particulars of a control's architecture is key to working effectively with the grid. The following slides will help detail the natural dividing lines of the control as well as its relationship with the underlying client-side data source component. At the heart of all Ignite UI data-bound controls is the igData source component. This is the client-side intermediary layer between the source data and the data-bound control, which takes responses from services, accepts local data like JSON, XML, HTML elements, and arrays. Much of the data-centric logic, as exhibited by the grid, is actually done in the data source. Features like paging and sorting and filtering and schema support are conducted in the data source control, and then the final result is made available to the data-bound control, which in this case is the grid. So the grid sits on top of the data source, but it also wraps calls to the data source. This is done so that you're able to configure and customize the grid directly, and you're not required to drop down and manipulate the data source independent of the grid. Like I said, many of the features of the grid have their logic counterparts implemented in the data source, but the very same features also need to render specialized UI elements to support that feature. For instance, when the data source does the work of paging the grid, it's the grid control that's responsible for rendering the pager buttons and any other required UI elements. The nice thing about each of these features is that they exist in a modular fashion. So in other words, if you don't tell the grid to use paging, then none of the process for paging is ever executed, and the data source doesn't do any of the paging logic. This keeps the grid performing very lean. All of these aspects working together are what make up the grid as a whole. So let's look at how each aspect interacts together in a little bit more detail. The data source component of the grid control lives on the client. Once the data source processes data from any number of input types, then data is eventually made available for the grid in the form of JSON arrays. Now, depending on the features that are enabled, the grid is responsible for pulling in the appropriate scripts to render the feature UI. So in this case, it's the functionality like paging and sorting and filtering and so on. The data source is responsible for performing the logic as associated with those features. And again, it only cares about the logic if the grid explicitly states that it's going to use a certain feature. Input for the data source can come from many forms. When the data is from a local origin, the input boils down to either arrays or JSON objects, which also includes JSON arrays, HTML elements, and this includes tables. But controls like our tree, they also can use unordered lists, and also XML data. When data comes from a service, then the options include WCF, OData, and JSONP. Simple JSON objects and arrays aren't listed up here at the top because returning JSON basically just makes it local in the browser, which then is available to the data source control also from that point. And finally, as this last element denotes, you can even create your own custom widgets independent of the grid to interface with the data source. And in fact, that's exactly what engineers at Infragistics do when they create a new data-bound control. All right, well, let's get into some of the demos, and let's start off with sorting. Okay, so here's the igGrid running in the browser, and this has the sorting feature enabled in it. So if we take a look at the grid over here, and I click on one of the header cells, it'll sort. And you can see this works as a toggle. So as I sort full name back and forth, it sorts to ascending and descending. Now you can have more than one sort applied to the grid as well. So if I want to sort it descending on full name and then sort it on age as well, you can see that I can apply both of these sorts at the same time. Now, if I want to remove one of the sorts, I can hold down the Shift key and then click on that header, and it removes the sort from the grid. Now, within each one of the demos, I'll have an instance of the grid up here where I can interact with it and show you how to work with the grid itself. And then I'll also show you a number of the different API calls that are available. And so from here, I'm able to sort, let's remove the sort here, and then sort full name. And this again toggles back and forth. And within each one of the buttons that I have available, there's a little preview of what the code is running underneath the hood in order to make this happen. So obviously you have to get an instance of the grid, but you'll call igGrid sorting, call the sort column method, pass in the index of the column that you want to sort, and then tell it what the direction is, so either ascending or descending. And so you'll see that model kind of used throughout each one of the demos. So that's the running version of it. Let's go ahead and take a look at the code. Now I'm going to step carefully through this entire HTML file so you have an idea of what's running through each one of the demos. And then as I go to subsequent demos, I'll kind of skip over all the stuff that's not specific to what I'm trying to show you. But here, starting at the top, you can see that I've got the HTML5 doc type, and so that sets us up well. And then I've got some references that I bring in here. So this first CSS file is for the API viewer. And the API viewer here is just basically a logging mechanism where we can see where events are happening, or if I want to show something explicitly done through code, it'll log it there so you can see it on the UI. As far as the control itself is concerned, it's completely irrelevant. It's something just for the demos I've created here. Now, what we do need for Ignite UI to work on this page is Modernizer. While Modernizer is not explicitly required, it really helps to have it available so that if you need to do any sort of feature detection, you have it available. So it's highly recommended, but it's not explicitly required. What is required is for you to have an instance of jQuery and jQuery UI. And so I've just made script references to those right there. And then I have a script reference to the loader. So the Infragistics.loader is the Ignite UI loader, and this is the loading component that's used in order to load in the JavaScript dependency files as well as the CSS files for not just the grid, but also any of the features that you tell the grid that you'll be using. And that can all be done declaratively. Then down here I have the API viewer JS. Again, this is logic for the API viewer. It's totally irrelevant to what you'll be doing. And then I have the markup. So the first thing in here is the table. Now, when you create an igGrid, when you create an instance of a grid, you have to associate it with some sort of HTML element on the page. Now, you can do that through a div, or you can do it through a table. Now, I strongly recommend that you make sure that you use the base element here as a table and not a div. It'll work as a div, and in fact, what will happen is that if you instantiate the control and point it at a div, the control will use that div as basically the main container, and then it'll generate a table beneath it. And that works okay for some things, but then when you start to interact with the control through its API, you can run into some problems. So you can avoid all that simply by making sure that the base element that you create for your igGrid is always a table. And then after that, you'll see that I have my button here, which allows me to execute some code against the grid. And then again, like I said, that input element that shows a preview of the code that's executing. So as I come down a little bit further, you can see that I'm starting off by declaring some setup properties for the IG loader. And so you need to tell it the base path that it will be looking at in order to grab those files. So the script path here, I have localhost, and then I have a virtual directory set up where I place all of my Ignite UI files. And then I can go down to the JS folder for the JavaScript and the CS folder for the CSS. And so then after it knows where those paths are, then I can declaratively say which resources I would like to use in the page, and it'll grab those. So here I'm saying I'm using the igGrid control, and then I'm using the igGrid.sorting feature. Now, here's a pro tip for you. As you're declaring resources in the loader, you want to make sure that you delimit each one of the resources with a comma, but you also want to make sure that you don't do something like this. You want to make sure that there are no spaces after that comma. If you have any spaces after the comma, you'll get an error. So you want to make sure that as resources are loaded into the loader, or as you define them for the loader, I should say, that you just delimit them with a comma and no spaces. So that will help your life along a lot easier if you follow that. So once the loader has loaded in all the files that it needs based off of the dependencies or the resources you've said that your page needs, then this loader function will fire and you have an opportunity to begin working with the page knowing that all the dependencies that you've set up are now available within the browser. So the API viewer here is just an instantiation of our little helper object where I can log everything out to the screen. And then I'm creating a data source for the grid. Here, this is just an array where I have some JSON objects loaded into it, where each record has an ID, a name, date of hire, age, salary, state, and whether or not they're active within the system. Now we get down to the meat of things. Here's where I'm instantiating an instance of the igGrid. So in doing that, I do that based off of a selector. So I'm looking at the element that has the the ID of grid. And if you recall from the top, that's the table here with the ID of grid. Once I have that item selected, then I can instantiate an instance of igGrid. I'm telling it to auto-generate columns to false because I want to explicitly set up the columns, and then give it a default width and say what the data source is. So if you recall that the data source comes from this array up here. So now I'm setting up each one of the columns. I've got the header text of active for the key for that column is active, and down on the line through each one of the data members in the data source that I showed you in the array. Now, for every single one of the demos, I have a link commented here. And something you need to be aware of for this link is that it's version dependent. So right now it's before the release of the 13.1 release. So once 13.1 is available or any other subsequent release is available, if you just change the version number up here, you'll get to the latest version of our API documentation. So the API documentation is very valuable to you because it gives you an opportunity to see the control or the feature, an overview of it. You can get into the options, you can dive into each one of the events, look at each one of the methods that are available, and they even see the CSS classes that are available for theming that behavior or feature or control itself. So if I come into methods, you can see that, let's see, sort column method. So this tells you, here's a little code sample of how you would use a sort column method. And it tells you what each one of the arguments are that you'd pass into this method. So the API documentation becomes very, very valuable for you as you're using these controls. And so that's why I placed them right there. So you can always refer back to them. And I have a funny feeling I might need to refer back to them as I look at some of the options in some of these demos. So here I'm saying that the features for the grid is defined as whatever inside this array. So obviously this kind of leads to the fact that you can load as many of the features as you want. I'm doing one at a time here, but we'll start off by saying that we're loading the sorting feature. The sorting type is local, and then I'm applying the sort column CSS. Now, right now it's set to false. If I switch that to true, and then refresh the page, refresh the page for real. There we go. When I sort on a column, you can see that it has a CSS class applied to it. And so now it's themed as a blue theme. So you can see which one of the columns are sorted against, which is nice. I have it set up as a case sensitive sort right now. The default is false. And you can set the first sort direction for the grid itself as either ascending or descending. You can say whether you want single or multiple sorts available within the grid. And then you have some tooltips available where you can say, as you hover over those header cells of whether it's sorted or unsorted, you might want to change the wording of that. Then within each one of the features, you have a column settings. And if the column settings are available, what you're able to do is narrow down by specific columns of some of the settings you want to have. So if I say that the column found at index 0, I'm going to allow sorting, but I want to say that its first sort direction, once you start sorting it, is ascending rather than descending like the whole grid. So column settings allow you just to get really fine-grained control over how that column will behave inside of the feature that you're defining. Then I'm handling the event of column sorted. So within this event, I have a UI argument that's available, which returns the direction of the sort. So if it equals undefined, then I know that that column is unsorted. Otherwise, I know that the column's sorted, and I can go ahead and get that direction and log that off to my API viewer. Now, lastly, I've got the functionality implemented here for that button that allows me to toggle the sorting. So here I'm setting aside a variable for the column settings and the initial direction, and then the index of the column. So I'm getting that value out of data-sort on index. So when I come up here to my button, you can see data-sort on index. I'm saying that I want the index of column, or column of index 1, which is the full name or the second column. And then when I come down here, I get basically an integer value taken out of that HTML element. So then I get the column settings. I can take a look at the grid itself, say out of the igGrid sorting. I'm passing in this option of column settings, so I have an instance of the column settings. Once I have that, then I can take a look, based off the index of the column I'm looking at, look at the current sort direction. If that doesn't equal undefined, then I can switch based off of whatever it is. So if it's ascending, I switch it to descending, and if it's not, then it goes to ascending. So once I have determined what sort direction I want to have, then I can go to the grid. Remember, this is an instance here of the selector of igGrid. So once this grid is created, it's set aside into this variable here. So I can go to grid, IG sorting, sort column, pass in the index, pass in the direction. And so that is the logic that we'll use to go back and forth between sorting the columns. All right, good. Now let's go ahead and take a look at filtering. So first you'll see that I've got a header row right up here that allows me to do some filtering capabilities on the grid. So let's take a look at first name for a moment. If I click on this, you can see all of the different conditions or operators basically that I can apply to the grid. So I can say that this starts with J. All right, well that filters all of the records out that don't start with a J. Okay, that's kind of nice. Clear that filter. If I go to higher date, I've got all of these date conditions that you can use. On, not on, after, before, last month, on and on. So this makes it really easy to work with the dates. Plus, once you pick one of those conditions, if you say this year, well, actually what we should do is before. And then at that point, I can drop down and use the calendar picker here to say I want it before March 15th, 2013, which all those records are. So that's kind of nice. Clear that filter. Now, if I come down and work with the grid programmatically and say that I want to filter the name for John. Now, notice how the filter expression shows up at the top on the column. And since this is working with the contains operator, it found John Smith and Mary Johnson. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code for filtering. Okay, so I'll take you down to where the loader is working. And so the thing that you want to keep in mind here is that we're bringing in igGrid.filtering. So sorting's not being brought in at this point, so none of the logic or the UI elements for sorting are being rendered as the payload of the grid. Of course, if you wanted to use both, you could, absolutely, but this just narrows it down to one feature at a time. So once the loader is done loading all the files, then I come through and set up the igGrid. So the same thing here, columns, data source, setting up the columns, everything is all the same as the last demo. Here though, in the features, I'm setting up filtering. So the name is filtering, of course, and I'm saying that the filtering is case sensitive. So it defaults to false, but you have the option of deciding whether or not you want to evaluate the filter based off of case sensitivity. Then within column settings, I can come in and say, okay, well, based off of this column key is active, I want to disable or allow filtering for that one. And then you can also say that you can turn it off as well. So we'll just set this to false. And so now when I refresh the page, you'll see that the header row is grayed out there. So you have individual control of your columns on whether or not you want to be able to filter on it. The filter delay here is right now set to 500 milliseconds. So if you want to basically throttle the filtering so that it's not happening so fast on each key press, or if you have it bound to a key press event or something like that, you can make sure that you're getting a couple characters or more before you're actually doing the filter. So you can set that filter delay to whatever is applicable for your application. And then you have the mode of simple or advanced. Now, like I'm saying in the comments here, it is case sensitive, so make sure you pay attention to your casing, because I got a little thrown off there for a few minutes one time when I capitalized advanced or something, I think. So when you go to advanced filtering, you'll notice that that filter row has now disappeared. Instead, what you have when you click on one of these little filter icons is you have this modal dialog, which allows you to build up a filter criteria. Some people like the Excel sort of interaction with the simple the search row or the filter row underneath, and other people like to be able to look at it all together within the dialog. So both are available. So going back to the code here, then there's the data filtered event. So when this event fires, you have access to the column, and you can chase after the column key here, and I'm just saying which one is filtered. So it's an interesting point to be made about these events, because as the events are raised, it's only going to be raised when you're interacting with the grid through the UI, basically. So if you tell the grid to filter programmatically, those events won't be raised. And the idea behind that is because if you're doing it programmatically, you already know which one you've told to filter. So you don't really need an event to say that it's been filtered. And that helps for the performance of the grid. So it's not firing off events that aren't necessary or won't end up being handled in the end. So the logic to filter the grid is actually quite simple. So I'm binding to a click event on my button. And once that happens, I'm taking a look at the value that's in the filter text box. Once I have that, then I can go to the grid and say, based off of the igGrid filtering feature, I run the filter method and pass in the field name, which is name, and then condition, which I'm looking at contains, and then the expression, which is the filter text. So you notice that this is an array. So again, even programmatically, you can build up a list of different filter conditions in order to filter on the grid. All right, so let's take a look at now the selection capabilities of the grid. So there's two ways that selection is implemented within the igGrid. So you have cell selection and you have row selection. And that's not something that you can change after the grid's been instantiated. So you need to decide what kind of selection that you want to have working within the grid when you create it. So if right now I'm working with cell selection, so I can click on this cell, and then I can take the arrow buttons on my keyboard and move it around. And this is basically the activation portion of selection working. So I'm activating and selecting cells as I'm keying around on the keyboard through the cells in the grid. Now I can hold down the Shift key and then select multiple cells. And in fact, if I go press on the down key, you can see that I can select and deselect cells by holding Shift and kind of arrowing around on the grid. I can also use my mouse and just hold down the left mouse button and sort of make selections and drag around, and so that works quite well. And you can also make non-contiguous selections. So if I click on this cell here and then hold down the Control key and then click on different cells, I missed it there, you can make non-contiguous selections. So there's a lot of different or a lot of flexibility in the way that you can make cell-based selections within the grid. So I'm going to go ahead and clear all those selections and then show you how programmatically I can select the first cell. I can get the active cell, and you'll see down here that the API viewer is responding to everything that I've done. I can get the selected cell here, it's the is active cell. It's in row 0, cell 0. Get selected cells if there's more than one cell selected. I can deselect the first cell, and then you can also use clear selection to just remove all selections, whether they're cell or row based, within the grid. So that's how you do it through cell selection. If you go to row selection, I can select the first row. I can get the active row, get selected row, again, the API viewer showing all this stuff. If there's multiple rows selected, I can get that. Deselect the first row or clear selection. This is just the same one that was called before. So when we take a look at the code for this, it's a little bit different than how I did the past two demos, just because I have this function here for create grid, or I'm passing in the selection mode. So when I actually go to create the grid itself, let me show you the HTML elements here. So I have a radio button here that's saying that I'm using either cell or I'm using row, which is down here, based selection. So from that radio button, that gets passed into create grid. So going back up to create grid, you can see that selection mode is passed in down to the feature here, selection mode. And this, again, just goes back to the fact that you can't change that once the grid is instantiated. So you have to choose between cell or row selection at the time of instantiation. So all this is the same as has been in the past. So let's go down to the feature. Again, the name is selection. I'm turning on activation, so I have that keyboard interaction available. Doing my selection mode, which is either row or cell, saying that I do want multiple selection. And then based off of these events here, I've got active cell, active row, cell selection changed, and row selection changed. And all of the information that I need about which cell or row has been either activated or selected or deselected is all through this UI argument that's passed in. And you can see through each one of these, I have row index, cell index, row index, selected cells length. So this gives you a collection of the selected cells, and you can loop through them and maybe change some CSS properties if you need to, or whatever your requirement is at the time. So all of these buttons that interact with the API are basically the same type of thing. So you'll notice here that everything is calling igGrid selection because that's the name of the feature. And then I'm calling different methods. So if I want the active cell, I call active cell. If I want the active row, I call active row. Selected cell, selected cells for a multiple selection. I can select the cell by calling this method and passing in the index of the row and of the column. I can select a specific row by index. I can get the selected rows of multiple selection, deselect a row, deselect a cell, and on and on. So the API for it is pretty expressive and pretty easy to grasp once you know exactly what you're trying to do with the grid. Okay, now let's bring in paging and take a look at that one. So there's the code, and here's the grid. So, oftentimes you're working with content that's too much to digest at one time, so you need to page that within the grid. Here, instead of binding to an in-memory array like I've been doing in the past, I'm binding to a JSON representation of the Northwind database products table. So you've probably seen these records so many times. So here, as I page through the grid, you can see I can go to page 2 and page 3 and page 4 and all of that. Go to the first page, to the last page, previous page, next, all that fun stuff. Beyond that, I can decide how many records I'd like to show, how many rows I'd like to appear within each page of the grid. So I can choose 8, I can use 20, and decide from there. So if I'm working with it programmatically, I can use this button to tell it to go to page 2, and I can even set the page size to 3. Again, events firing and some stuff going on under the covers that I'll show you as we dive into the script here. So loader, igGrid.paging is what brings in the paging feature. So with that feature, here, let me just show you, I'm bringing in, let's see, where is it? Here, Northwind products. So the data source for the grid is coming from a variable that's created within Northwind products. And so that creates the products variable, and that's added in as the data source for the grid. So here I'm instantiating the grid, setting up the paging feature, and saying the initial page size is 5. Right here with this array is where you have the ability to decide what the page size list will be. So you can make this any arbitrary numbers that you want, 5, 10, 20, on and on, 8, 3, 2, whatever you want to have happen. Then as far as the events that I'm handling, at least, page index changed, page rendered, and page size changed. So you're able to hook into those events each time that happens within the grid. And here I'm just looking at the page index and the page size based off of that UI argument that's passed into it. In order to make things happen programmatically, I go to the igGrid paging feature, run the page index method, and pass in the index that I want to jump to. And so that's what makes the page go to that, or makes the grid go to that page. And then the same thing with page size, passing in the value for the number of rows that you want to show up within an individual page. All right, well, the next feature is group by. And this is one of the neat features of the grid where you take a flat grid and it can begin to behave more like a hierarchical grid. So if I group the data within this grid based off of the discontinued column, I can take just this column header and drag it up into the group by area. When I let go of it, you'll see that the data is now grouped by the values here in the discontinued column. So I've got 17 items that are not discontinued and 3 items that are discontinued. So if I want to change this, I can grab another item and basically chain a grouping. You'll see how it shows up here. Now I don't think there's any values of price that repeat within each one of the groups here, so you'll just kind of see them itemized out. But if there were repetition in pricing, it would show them in groups as well. So I just click on that little X in order to remove a grouping. So I can do it all through the drag and drop type of interaction here. But if you're on a touch mobile device or something like that, then you can come up here and select individual columns for grouping. So here I can remove the group, add the group, clear all, or group by multiple items. So if I apply that, things get a little a little crazy. So I'll remove all these out. Now, when I'm dealing with the grid programmatically, I can specifically say which column I want to group on. So here I'll say group by discontinued. And so here's the grouping done by discontinued. I can get the grouped columns. Here, the grouped columns are returned to the API viewer. I can open up that dialog through the API. I can also close it. I can ungroup by a specific column here. So I'll ungroup the discontinued column. I'll group it back again and show you how you can just ungroup all if there's a bunch of groups applied to it. You can do that in one shot. So there's a lot of flexibility available to you within, again, a flat grid by being able to do a bunch of groupings. So let's close everything else but this so that I don't get anything confused here. So coming down to the script, again, igGrid group by is the feature name you want to use within the loader. Then we come down to the feature and you have all this code that you have to write. So the thing about group by is that once you turn it on, you're either going to group by a column or you're not. So there's not a lot of events or other things that you have to set up for it. In order to make it happen programmatically though, you go into the feature by calling igGrid group by, the group by method, and then say which one of the columns by key that you want to group. You can open the dialog, you can close the dialog, ungroup all, and then also ungroup by a specific column, again passing in the key. And then here you can get the group by columns by getting the collection of columns that are grouped. Okay, next up is everybody's favorite, column moving. Page isn't refreshing there so easy, so let me go like that. Okay, so now what you can do within the column moving feature is grab a header and it can move to different positions within the grid. So there's two types of column moving. You've got deferred, and I forget what the other one is. We'll look at it in the code, but basically where you can see here that the moving is happening as I'm putting it across different positions in the grid. And the other type is when you let go, that's when the moving is done. So I can also come in here and say explicitly through the API that I want to move the price column, and I move that over to a specific spot. So let's take a look at the code that's required to make all of this happen. So scrolling down, here's the loader, bringing in column moving. Now what I did was I wanted to still use the Northwind products table, but there's 20 records within that. And I want you to be able to see the API viewer. So I'm just getting the top 5 products off that array and using that as the data source for the grid. So that's why you see that there. When you come down to the features, I'm enabling column moving, and I'm saying add moving dropdown, set that to false. So let's move that to true so you can see, and it works best when you spell the Boolean values correctly. So let's refresh the page so you can see what that dropdown does. So again, this is more for when you're working with touch-enabled environments. So you can't really drag and drop the column headers if you're on an iPad or WinRT device or something like that. So you can click on this, and then you can choose whether you want it to move first, left, right, last, on and on. So move left, all is well. When you come into column settings, you have the ability to, again, narrow down into the column of what you want it to do specifically. So I'm saying for product ID, I don't want to allow moving for that. So the default is to true. So if you want to make sure a certain column cannot move, you need to explicitly turn off that functionality. So here the mode is either deferred or immediate. So immediate is what will allow, I think this is supposed to be 2 R's. And then when we use it, or is it not? Yeah. There we go. So now when we move, okay, so yeah, this is deferred. So when I am moving it across the grid, you can see that it's not doing any of the moving action until I let go. So you can decide which is better for you users, either the deferred or the immediate mode. Now the move type is either render or DOM. So the difference between this is that it's either going to re-render the grid right there and then based off of the movement that's been done, or it will go in and recreate new DOM elements. And so there's certain features that depend on the different types. And so as you work with the grid, you'll have to decide which one is best. But you have both of those options available to you. And then there's a tooltip for when you're moving columns, which is nice, and the event here that I'm handling for column moved. And I'm just chasing after the UI argument to say what's the column key and saying it's moved. So in order to move a column programmatically, call into igGrid column moving, run the move column method, and say that the column that I want to move is unit price. I want it to go next to product name, and then there's this Boolean of whether or not I want it to go after that. Do I want it to go after this column or not? So true says that it will go after, false says it will go before. And then with the move type here, I have the same option, and this is an optional parameter of whether or not I want it to render either as, or I want the mode to be as render or DOM. So again, you can make that decision as you make the call to moving a column. Okay, so yes, you can move columns, but you can also resize columns. So let's take a look at this really quick. Now, starting off with the name column, you'll notice that, well, let's go to quantity first. If I resize this one, I can kind of just resize it however I want. No big deal. Take it ridiculously small, ridiculously large, no big deal. But with name, I don't have as much control. So when I make it smaller, it can't go any lower or any narrower than 100 pixels, and it can't go any wider than 200 pixels. So there's a constraint on this column of how the resizing feature will behave. The other thing that's kind of nice is, let's say I've made this really big, and just like Excel, when I go to the column boundary, if I double click on that, that resizes the column to the widest length of whatever's in the width of the widest cell contents. So here, I think this item here was probably the longest, or maybe this one or the same, I don't know, but that's what it lined up to. So programmatically, I can go into it and say grid resizing, call the resize method. I'm looking at the unit price column, and I want it to be set to 100 pixels. And so there you can do that just as easily. So taking a look at the code, to set up the feature, I enable resizing, allow double click to resize, that's set to true, defaults to true, but it showed you there explicitly. Within the column settings, here's the distinction that I want you to take a look at. Here I'm chasing after the column by key, and then the next one I'm doing it by column index. So you usually have that option of being able to set up the column settings by key or index, whichever one you happen to have available to you. So if you're looping through and you have an indexer available, then sometimes column index will work nicely. So here I'm saying allow resizing false. Well, minimum and maximum width don't really make much of a difference when you're not resizing. But down here, resizing is set to true, and my minimum and maximum width do make a difference. So remember, it can only go down to 100 pixels and no larger than 200 pixels. So defer resizing is the same thing, kind of like with column moving. You're either resizing as you're dragging that boundary, or it'll resize once you let go of the mouse button. Then for this event here, I've got column resized, and I'm taking a look at the column key. So this fires when it's done through the UI. And then in order to perform the resize, is basically like what I showed you on the page. You call the resize method, you tell it which key, column key you want to use, and then you say what width you want that column to be. Let me close all these up, show you tooltips. Now the way tooltips work are when you have a column that the contents of the column goes beyond the boundary of the column, then you have the tooltip that's available to show up. Now this works well within desktop as well as touch scenarios, in that right here where I'm hovering over the cell, the tooltip shows up, and then when I hover away from it, it disappears. But if it's in a touch scenario, when you tap on that cell, the tooltip will show up, and then you see the X in the top right hand corner of the tooltip. You can just tap on that and it'll go away. So you have some control over where it's positioned, how fast the animation works, and all that good stuff, all done through the feature. So once we set up the feature, saying we're enabling tooltips, again with the loader, it's igGrid.tooltips. Have the tooltips available, and cursor left offset. So that's 30 pixels, and cursor top offset 30 pixels. The fade time span, this is in milliseconds, so you can decide how fast or how slow you want that fade to go in. So it happens pretty quick by default. It's 150 milliseconds. I pumped it up to 300. It's still, it looks nice easing in and out. Obviously, the lower number you get, the faster it'll be, so it'll either pop in or out, or if you want it slower, to fade in or out. With column settings, here I'm taking a look at the column key, and I'm saying allow tooltips false, and for product name, allow tooltips true. Just to make the point that, again, column by column, you can decide how you want it to behave. The show delay and hide delay are there basically for you to decide how fast you want the program to wait before it shows the tooltip or hides the tooltip. So I'm doing the show delay at 1 second. So if I'm hovering over a cell for at least a second, then it'll show the tooltip. If I'm just kind of quickly going through it, then it doesn't even try to show them. And then hide delay, after you mouse off of that, how long is it going to wait before it tries to fade out that tooltip? So then you have a couple events here, tooltip hidden and shown, where you can find out if those have been hidden or shown. And again, within the args, you have the column key that's available. So let's go ahead and move along to virtualization. Now, the key to virtualization is the fact that you can have a grid that stays very responsive even though you've loaded a ton of information into it. So if you look down here, you can see that there are 51,000 products loaded into the grid's data source. And as I start interacting with the grid, if I scroll down here, it's performing pretty well. It's pretty snappy, and I can come in here to the scroll bar and kind of go near the bottom, and you can see that the scroll bar shows a pretty accurate representation of where it's at within the set of records based off of the quantity. So what virtualization does is it gives you a chance to load a lot of different information or a lot of different records into the grid, but it still remains really responsive. The other thing I want to show you is that if I scroll with the mouse wheel, notice how quickly it goes through the records. Now, I just copied and pasted these records over and over and over again. So as I'm scrolling, you're not really seeing it update because it's just looking at the same data. But as I scroll through with the mouse wheel, it's actually going to very specific points within the data. So if we take a look at setting up the feature, let's bring the code in here. Come down here, and virtualization actually isn't a feature, technically a feature of the grid. It's a part of the grid itself. It's a base part of functionality of the grid. So you'll notice I'm not declaring any features, but virtualization is set up just through individual properties on the base part of the grid. So here I'm enabling virtualization, saying virtualization mode is fixed. And let's take a review of what the other mode is. Don't remember right off the top of my head. So we come here to options and come to virtualization mode. So it's fixed and continuous, okay? And so the difference between fixed and continuous is fixed updates the same rows. It keeps the same instances of rows and updates it with new data from the data source. Continuous re-renders whatever the chunk of rows is that's required in order for the size of the grid, and then discards the old rows. So depending on how you're interacting with the grid, you may want fixed or continuous, but both modes are available to you. And then the height is 300 pixels. This is important because as you're working with a virtualized grid, height's important because if you just let the height be whatever, it'll try to expand to the size of however many rows there are. And you don't want to do that. You want to give it a constraint so that you can virtualize the interaction with the data. And then the virtualization mouse wheel step, I'm saying here that I want every time I turn the mouse wheel, it moves about 250,000 pixels. So based off the amount of data that's in your grid, you may want to have different values for how the mouse wheel steps through there. So there you go. That's a quick overview of 9 different interactive features of the Ignite UI igGrid. So I'll go ahead and take any questions that you have now at this time.